The Edwardian Samuel Coleridge Taylor caused a sensation on 3 trips to the USA, conducting his own compositions. In one of them, we can hear early and tantalizing evidence of the melodic style of what came to be known as the blues, which, albeit in different disguises, went on to dominate the music of the 20th century and beyond. The clues we're looking for are so-called flattened degrees of the musical ladder, or scale, at the 3rd and 7th position, especially when the phrase is heading in a downward direction. And here they both are, one after another, in this melody. 3rd, 7th. The blues, as it developed slowly and piecemeal amongst former slave communities in the USA in the final decades of the 19th century, clung resolutely to the flattened 3rds and 7ths, and does so to the present day. Indeed, they became known as blue notes. Blue notes, revivalist spirituals, the call and response or holler songs of the Deep South, all derived from their African origins, went into the mixing pot of the early blues. But also mixed in were chords borrowed from hymns and parlor and vaudeville songs, and the folk songs of other members of the American underclass. There's been considerable research into song forms of the poorest Americans of all ethnic groups in the 19th century. It reveals the influence of Anglo-Celtic folk music on the growth of the blues. This folk music was learnt from the African Americans' co-workers in the cotton fields and on the railroads, many of whom were from the British Isles. Amongst these song types are hundreds which lament the burden and misery of the labourer's life. Typical is the iconic American work song, The Ballad of John Henry, the steel-driving man, which eventually became a blues standard. It celebrates the futile battle between an African-American railroad worker and a new machine designed to replace him. Music historians have traced the shape back to the much earlier British ballad, The Birmingham Boys. Listen out for the overall storytelling shape and the repeated line at the end. In Birmingham town there lived a man, and he had such a lovely wife, and so dearly she loved company, as dearly as she loved life, boys, life, as dearly as she loved life. Now here's one of the many later versions of John Henry. John Henry was a little baby, sitting on his mother's knee. He picked up a hammer in his little right hand, says a hammer's gonna be the death of me, Lord, Lord, a hammer's gonna be the death of me. One of the changes that's happened to the tune crossing the Atlantic is that it's become entirely pentatonic. Remember those 5 basic notes prevalent in Eastern music that Debussy imitated? And who were the other railroad workers toiling alongside the British, Irish and African-American labourers? Now, even to suggest any European influence on the blues is controversial, and it's entirely understandable that there should be sensitivity about any non-African elements in the origin of the blues. Since the music of the slaves, from which it sprang, was so often a lament or a coded protest against the harsh treatment they received, some African Americans quite naturally resent the idea that the blues could in any way have been influenced by the very people who enslaved their ancestors. But the fact is that music does not observe racial or national boundaries. It's a free-flowing river, open and available to all cultures, owned by none. Whatever elements went into its kit of parts, the early blues musicians made something unique and lasting of their own. This same intermingling of styles and traditions can be seen in the arrival at around the same time of ragtime, which became a kind of craze. Rag, or ragtime music, originated in St. Louis and Chicago bars and brothels, from house pianists copying the popular marching band style of the 1880s and 90s, a fashion that reached its peak with the band leader John Philip Sousa. In order to emulate the whole band, bass, accompanying chords and tune, the pianist had to leap about the keys frantically, resulting in a quite virtuoso left-hand motion from bass to chord and back. On top of this accompanying oompa, the rag pianists wove a catchy tune that pulled the rhythm around, a technique called syncopation. Syncopation is like talking with the emphasis on the wrong words to create a jerky sound. Listen to this bit of Scott Joplin's Maple Leaf Rag without syncopation. And now with Joplin's syncopations, which feel like they're tripping ahead of where you'd expect them to fall. Ragtime picked up syncopation, a playful jumping ahead of the tune, from the banjo or piano accompaniments for cakewalks, a jokey form of dancing that plantation workers had invented for their own amusement, in lampooning imitation of white folks' la-di-da ballroom dancing. The white folks in question used to enjoy watching their staff's cakewalk parties, not realising that what they thought was a comic and ludicrous African-American dance step was actually a caricature of them. Along with the cakewalk, another offspring of ragtime was a hyper-syncopated form of piano and band playing that flickered into life in the Storyville district of New Orleans. Charismatic performers like Jelly Roll Morton took it on tour around the southern states in travelling vaudeville shows. Though Jelly Roll called a lot of his numbers blues, we now know this is the beginning of a distinct genre of its own, jazz. From now on, this music took on a life of its own. As up-to-the-minute blues and its many offspring began to revolutionise popular music, classically trained composers found themselves outflanked and increasingly unloved. Given the choice, the general public voted with their feet in their millions and took the populist path. The coming century would see popular music, especially American popular music, sweeping the planet. And yet, faced with the twin rebellions of dissonant modernism and the mass market, the classical tradition found an ace up its sleeve and played it with impeccable timing. In a world of turmoil and change, its response was nostalgia. Edward Elgar's most famous piece, Enigma Variant,
I would like to make a difference.
Your job? Out-monster the monster.
It's Christmas Eve 1906, and from Brant Rock, a wind-lashed signalling station in Massachusetts, a momentous sound is heard. It's the first ever wireless broadcast of a piece of recorded music, Handel's Largo, transmitted by an intrepid radio pioneer, Reginald Fessenden. From these small, crackly beginnings, a global industry would soon grow. This historic broadcast ushered in a new age for music, an age when music would belong to everyone, everywhere, often, as it was in this case, enjoyed completely free. Radio and its close relation, the gramophone record, had a completely unexpected effect. While many hours of classical music were recorded and broadcast, most of all, radio and records helped local forms of folk music find a global audience for the first time in history, especially American folk music based around the blues. The invention of new recording techniques and the rise of the popular music that benefited from them is the big story of the last 100 years in music. Thanks to radio play, gramophone records, and now the internet, popular music has swept the planet. The advent of free-to-air music for the world's grateful millions would change the value, purpose, and style of music more dramatically than any other development in history.